Welcome back to Media 7, where I'm talking perks, politics and the public purse with Matthew Hooton, Tim Watkin and Barry Soper. This year's expenses scandals have seized the headlines, but they're not without precedent. Jose Barbosa looks at the dirty laundry, or underpants, of Parliament's past.
You could be forgiven for thinking that our current crop of MPs are a bunch of system-rorting reprobates, sucking the teats of the public coffers. Well, the good news is that they've always been cheating rat bags. In 1997, New Zealand First MP Tuku Morgan was eviscerated in the press and in Parliament after it came to light that he was still drawing a director's fee from the Aotearoa television network, despite claiming he'd resigned from the board before becoming an MP. It turned out he'd used taxpayer money given to the network to buy a number of pricey items, including an $89 pair of underpants, roughly worth $125,000 in today's money, and some nice Turkish rugs. Back then, spending concerns were a bit more mundane. The then government whip, John Carter, was ready to take the knife to the taxi chit allowance. Fresh from the rugby academy, Duncan Garner was on the case, asking why Labour MP Jonathan Hunt's taxi bill was so large.
I'm entitled to it, and I chose to travel by taxi.
Another vital issue back then was that of travel rebates for former MPs, including one David Butcher. He was eventually convicted for fraudulently claiming the rebate. The travel perks were what gave Rodney Hyde his notoriety.
That travel perk is scandalous, it should be stopped, and it should be stopped immediately.
The trouble over where Bill English calls home is nothing new. In 2001, Marion Hobbs and Philip Bunkel were on the receiving end of an act and national attack, after it was revealed they'd both been claiming out-of-town allowances to subsidise accommodation in Wellington. Both were eventually cleared, and as usual, no one seemed to know exactly what the rules were. John Tamahiri was forced to eat humble pie and take the fall in 2004, while being investigated for receiving a golden handshake from the Waipurera Trust. He was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, but agreed to spend 4 hours every day with Willie Jackson as a form of preventative detention. So the past was just as crappy as the present. However, it's worth noting that when our elected officials break the rules, sometimes it's for our own good.
Perhaps it's a very cheap lesson for the New Zealand taxpayer because it's highlighted something which was probably long overdue having a look at.
Jose Barbosa there. Well, Barry, it's funny because none of us could remember the David Butcher thing, and yet that, on the face of it, is much worse than anything we've talked about today.
And that last woman you had on the clip there, that was she was a cabinet minister known as the Minister of Shopping, because she used to go to Paris all the time and
Consumer Affairs Minister, yes.
Taxpayers' expense, and shop for beautiful shoes and what have you. And she was then a minister for New Zealand First. So it has been going on since time immemorial. I think, though, to say that John Tamahiri suffered greatly because of a perk. In fact, it was more to do with the fact that he didn't realise the tape recorder was running on a reporter's table, and gave some fairly candid views of his cabinet colleagues, just as Rodney Hyde recently did of John Key. So whilst politicians basically have always been a bit silly, they've always rorted the system because the system allows itself to be rorted, you know. And that's
the problem with John Tamahiri was he said he didn't take the payment. If he said he'd taken it, then he might have been able to forge through it. But his problem was that he said he wasn't going to and he hadn't, and it turned out that he had.
Yes. But politicians, because the system then wasn't as transparent as it is now, and it's only this year that at the behest of the Greens that the books have been opened, and like I said, in 3 months' time we'll see another lot of expenses, and no doubt, although I think a good example of the latest lot was the fact that Chris Carter, who was the globe-trotting Minister of Education, God only knows why a Minister of Education has to go to China and the United States and Britain with his partner. Goodness only knows, but nevertheless he had reined in his expenses, so maybe they are slowly learning the lesson.
Well, that makes it worse, doesn't it? I mean, if you're spending all this money, suddenly there's transparency, and then you cut back your expenditure, it brings the original expenditure.
But I mean, one thing that jumped out for me, particularly with the Hobbs and Bunkel accommodation allowances thing, is the rules weren't clear. Fast forward to 2009 and the rules aren't clear.
A very similar thing with Bill English. Now, Bill English's house was in a family trust. Now, his primary place of residence has to be Dipton, which is where, of course, his electorate is. So he's entitled to claim what he did. But he lost. Well, I'm just going to say that he lost the moral high ground by not just moving it into a family trust, but saying, I'm going to now forfeit any allowance. Well, he's entitled to it.
Well, this is right. And one of the problems, I think, for them is that they've moved away from the principle that you might get a house or an apartment paid for that you move into with your family, or compared with these allowances. And Bill English could have. He has, I think, the most children of any minister in the cabinet. That entitled him to the famous Bolton Street residence, which must be worth $8–10 million. And he could have lived there, which would have an effective rent of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and no one would have asked any questions. But because it was moved to a cash system, everyone complains. I think you're actually better to say, if you are a minister, if we think it's necessary, force the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Trade Minister, all ministers, to have a house in which they can entertain, then we're better to give them a house rather than the cash. Well,
I remember a Labour cabinet minister called Franco Flynn, who was the police minister. He had a house not far away from the one you were talking about in Bolton Street. When he became the minister, he decided he'd move out of that house, and he let it I thought he was rather innovative, he let the house to none other than Jim Bolger. And then he went and lived in a ministerial house. So, you know, it's swings and roundabouts.
I think we were all a bit shocked to find out how much of that sort of thing was going on, MPs renting their apartments.
Reported on them. I mean, that was a very celebrated case.
Matthew, do you think that the Bill English thing was well managed? Because I've got my doubts. John Key stood up and said that I think the first version of it was that the family trust was a material factor in eligibility for that allowance. 2 days later, he stood up and said it wasn't. It took a while to unwind this one, didn't it?
And the primary fault was, well, the first thing is he wants to say that he lives in Dipton for political reasons. And also he makes the point that his family has lived there for some hundreds of years, and the road is called English Road, and you know, you can understand that. It sounds a bit like landed gentry. I'm not sure it's a good political message, but that's how he feels. And then he also had this house in Wellington, and he could have said, well, I'm now the Deputy Prime Minister, I should move to the Bolton Street residence, and then it wouldn't have
Jerry
come up.
Brownlee's in there.
And Jerry Brownlee's in there by himself. I mean, it's a crazy
but
situation.
There is a question
really.
about the Dipton one. I mean, one of the rules of thumb that have been used, I know, in the past has been, where does your wife live? And, you know, Mary is in Wellington. And I think there's a certain amount of reality that voters will see through that pretty quickly. Your family residence.
Do you think that was that well covered in the media? I thought Audrey Young did a good job of putting that all together. It did seem like it was much harder to put together than it should have been. Surely this could have been
dumped all in one go. It was a pretty clear-cut case. But the problem was that Bill let it run on for so long, and then he acknowledged that politics is about perception. And the perception was that he was the man telling us to tighten our belts, whilst all the time he was loosening his. And that was the perception, and it certainly was. But not only did he pay back the money, he forfeited all his rights to what his entitlement is.
Which undermines the system.
Which is, I mean, and this is the thing, that we're now having this situation where you've got your rules and then you've got what you're meant to do, and the two are so different now. You've got to have some sympathy for these people.
But I mean, this has been the story about Bill English this year. He's the treasurer. Surely there are more important stories about Bill English than this one, and yet it's the one that we've...
Well, the only thing Bill English has really done this year is borrow. I mean, there's not a hell of a lot he's done. And
maybe a little more complicated.
Well, of course it's a little more complicated, but he's borrowing, $1 billion a month at the moment. So I think the chickens will come home to roost next year when he presents his budget. And that's when the telling time for the national government.
I mean, I was struck by John Armstrong's column in the Herald last week, saying that, English has been blighted by the accommodation scandal, but the TVNZ 7 promo has saved him. I thought... How about something about him being, in charge of the economy?
It's only a small global recession.
But in a sense, though, if this was a bold reforming government with a clear agenda, I'm sure many people are pleased it isn't. But if it was coming in, floating the dollar, pulling out of ANZUS, getting rid of the farm subsidies, cutting benefits, raising benefits, introducing KiwiSaver, whatever the thing might be, we wouldn't be hearing about these stories because people would be focusing on the substance of the government. So in some ways, the government is responsible
because
for
the other great forgotten story of the last week is, as Rodney Hyde said, it's a do-nothing government, and he's the only one taking ideas to cabinet.
What a scandal that was. I mean, here was a man that basically was given 2 places at the cabinet table and all the perks that go with them, and he got 3.65% of the vote. Now, you know, you would think that he could show some loyalty at least to a man who had just a few days before had been defending him about the perks, and that's how he's repaid. Well, that's the other thing I think that Rodney Hyde has now got.
He also tried to get a
apologise.
journalist not to report it, which I thought was kind of interesting as well.
He tried to get
Martin van Benen at the press to
so you'd be dishonourable.
Surely he's sophisticated enough to know if you ask a journalist not to report it, you're advertising. I mean, are we sure that he was...
As Fran O'Sullivan said on Q&A on Sunday as well, that you know, this isn't the first time Rodney's done this. He does actually have a tradition of going to business meetings and saying less than favourable things about the government. So...
well, I dread to think what he said to those right-wing think tanks he was talking to on his trip with Louise, actually. I mean, no one asked what he was doing at those.
He gave a speech in London, and I can't remember the exact words.
At Reform,
And it was the Business Round Table in London when he was there at the family wedding. And basically he said that, look, MPs will have their fingers in the purse for as much as the public will allow them to. Now, I'm not exactly quoting him, but there was a line in that speech that I thought said a lot about Rodney Hyde.
And it wasn't barely reported. Now, we kicked off right at the top with looking at the British expenses scandals, which have had a massive impact on the political environment there. I don't see something of that, you know, there's been a collapse in confidence in the system there. I don't see that happening here.
No.
It's nowhere near as bad as that.
It's not. But why? One of the reasons why it resonates with people is that it's about their relationship with their MP, their relationship through the taxes they pay, and their relationship through the sense that these people are supposed to be there to serve the public, not to be able to actually work to their own ends. And I think that's where people get angry.
The Hyde story was as big as it was, and I think Matthew said it earlier, because this was the man that was a self-proclaimed perk buster, said that he was going to wipe all the perks. And the thing that I find, he sounds a bit, no insult to schizophrenics, but his statement was quite schizophrenic when he said that, look, you know, I don't like these 90% perks, but I'll take them anyway. Well, what does he mean by that? He either likes them or he dislikes them, he doesn't take them. You know.
I wonder where this is going to go from here. I mean, one angle that strikes me has been completely left behind is the fact that there was that conflict between Buddy McIrie and Hone Harawira in the first place. Is there a story behind that?
Well,
no
the thing is,
one.
To me, it's been interesting in all of this how quiet Tara Turia has been on this, because you've got to remember that she likened colonisation to the Holocaust when she was in the Helen Clark government, and Clark hated that, and of course they had a very public falling out. Now, the inflammatory nature of that email, I mean, I read it and I couldn't believe it, and I think you said earlier, Tim, that the reason that was made public was silly old Hone said to Billy McIrie that, look, make it public, P.S., make it public, see if I care.
He was angry.
Well, he made it public, and certainly he does care.
Well, he was angry. I mean, what happened, I mean, if we want to look at that exchange, the first person in that email exchange to use the forbidden word was Buddy McIrie, and he responded. I mean, it was a stupid thing to do. People use that language. I think it's very important that we don't get all puritanical about these things and pretend that...
No, but it's the racist nature. It wasn't actually the language, it was the racist nature of raping...
People say all sorts of things, don't they?
Yeah, well, they do, but maybe they shouldn't be.
Anyway,
the politics of it, though.
We do actually have to wrap up here, I'm sorry. But, yeah, I do look forward to someone doing the story on where the fault line is between Buddy McIrie and Hone Harawira. I think there's a good story there, so maybe in a future show. But that does conclude this discussion. Thank you to Matthew Hooton, Tim Watkin and Barry Soper, who I could have let go for ages. After the break, the journalists who will report the future.